Snow whispered down from a sky heavy with silence, soft as breath upon the wide, empty land. The rancher's horse moved slow through the drifts, hooves muffled, steam rising from its nostrils like ghost smoke. He had ridden home late, shoulders stiff from labor and solitude, and the thought of a warm fire was the only promise guiding him. But as he neared his veranda, something shifted in the night. Shadows bent wrong, a shape too fragile for winter's edge. He reined in hard, heart thudding once, twice, before the sound reached him, a child's voice, thin but unbroken. "We slept here last night, sir. Ma'am gave birth 3 days ago." The words cracked through the snowfall, not loud but piercing. On the wooden floor lay a woman, curled weak against the cold, her hair damp with frost, her breath shallow as if each exhale might be her last. Beside her, swaddled in a thin blanket, a newborn stirred with a soft cry, the sound barely rising above the wind. And in front of them, barefoot and stiff with courage, stood a girl no more than 5, eyes wide and shining with a bravery far too old for her years. The rancher froze in his saddle. For a breath, the world stopped. Snowflakes hung midair, his lungs locked, and the weight of years pressed down on him. He saw, not strangers, but a vision out of his own buried sorrow. A wife once gasping for breath. An infant stilled too soon. He had bricked those memories behind silence, but now they returned, raw as if they had never left. The girl lifted her chin, though her lips quivered blue. "We didn't knock," she whispered, "'cause everyone beats us when we do." No accusation carried in her voice, only a matter-of-fact weariness. Yet it struck deeper than a bullet. The rancher dismounted slowly, boots sinking into snow, his great frame shadowing the fragile scene. His hand trembled as he tied off the reins. The horse snorted, sensing his unease. He crouched, rough gloves brushing the frost off the mother's sleeve. Her eyes fluttered open, then shut again, as though shame itself was heavier than the storm. Her face bore not defiance, but the hollow endurance of someone who has walked too long with hunger. The rancher's voice came low, unused to company. "How long ve you been here?" The girl pressed closer to her mother, her small hand gripping the edge of the blanket around the infant. "Since yesterday. The snow came, and Ma'am said we'd be safe if we stayed still." Safe. On a bare veranda with no fire, no food, nothing but sky and splinters. His throat tightened. He had lived years avoiding people, avoiding need, because to help meant to hurt again. But here need had come to his doorstep, uninvited, undeniable. The woman stirred weakly, her cracked lips parting. "We'll go," she murmured, a whisper thin as wind through slats. "Just restin'. Don't mean to trouble." Trouble. The word lanced through him. He remembered another woman calling herself a burden, apologizing even as fever burned her away. He remembered not being able to save her. The girl's voice broke the memory. "Please, sir. Ma'am's real tired." He swallowed hard, the snow biting at his lashes. For a long moment he could not move. Then, with a suddenness that startled even himself, he slid his arms beneath the woman's frail body. She weighed less than the saddle he carried daily, and that truth shamed him. The newborn wailed softly as he lifted them, his greatcoat falling around them like a sheltering wing. The girl gasped but did not resist. She followed close as he stepped across the threshold, boots thudding against the wooden planks. The cabin air was sharp with smoke and old leather, but to them it must have been paradise after the open cold. He laid the mother near the hearth, fire still glowing from the embers he had banked at dawn. He bent, stoked it with practiced hands, until flame leapt and shadows fled. The girl knelt beside her mother, smoothing damp hair back with tiny fingers. Her eyes darted once toward the rancher, uncertain, searching for judgment. He could not summon any. He only moved stiffly to hang his coat by the fire, then poured water into a tin cup. "No child ought to meet the cold this way," he muttered, voice low as gravel. "Not in God's country." The girl's lips pressed tight, as though she feared to hope. The woman stirred, reaching toward the sound, but her hand fell back weakly. He set the cup aside and stood over them, the fire painting his weathered face in light and shadow. Something shifted inside him, the weight of solitude bending toward something he had not felt in years, a fragile duty, a trembling mercy. The girl broke the silence, her voice almost a vow. "We won't be trouble, sir. We just needed somewhere the snow wouldn't find us." His gaze lingered on the newborn, whose chest rose and fell with fragile persistence. Outside, the storm thickened, wind rattling the shutters like restless bones. Inside, the fire crackled louder, filling the room with warmth that seemed suddenly alive with memory and promise. The rancher's hands curled into fists at his sides, as though holding back words too heavy to speak. He had not asked for them, had not opened his door. Yet here they were, laid upon his life like fate itself. Snow struck harder against the window, the night closing in. And though he said nothing more, the girl's eyes brightened with the faintest flicker of trust, as if she already knew the choice he had yet to name. The fire had caught strong now, flames licking the iron grate, shadows bending long across the plank floor. The woman lay on a blanket near the hearth, her body slack in exhaustion, her skin pale with hunger and blood loss. The newborn whimpered fitfully in its swaddling, a sound like the faint creak of a door in wind, and the girl sat cross-legged beside them both, her little shoulders squared as though the weight of guardianship belonged to her alone. The rancher moved through the cabin with a heaviness that was not clumsiness but restraint, as though each gesture carried the memory of another time he had once failed. The air smelled of smoke, pine sap, and faint leather polish. He poured water into a tin cup and crouched, pressing it to the woman's cracked lips. She swallowed faintly, then turned her head, muttering something about debt, about leaving soon. He hushed her with a simple motion of a hand, firm, silent, without argument. The girl's eyes followed him, round and unblinking, like a stray pup waiting to learn whether the boot that loomed above would strike or shelter. He reached for the iron kettle hanging near the coals, poured its steaming contents into a chipped mug, and placed it carefully in her small hands. Her fingers trembled with the heat, and her eyes flickered between gratitude and fear. "It's milk," he said, his voice roughened by disuse. "Best I got." The girl sipped, cautious, and a sigh left her lips as if she hadn't tasted warmth in months. "Ma'am ain't eat much since the baby come." He nodded once, then stood to fetch a small loaf of stale bread and some jerky softened in broth. He placed them on a plate by the girl, then knelt again at the mother's side, propping her carefully against a folded quilt. The touch was gentle despite his great scarred hands, and for a moment he felt the echo of another body he had once held this way, his wife's frame wasting beneath fever. He shook the memory away as one might shake off rain. The mother opened her eyes then, dull with shame. "We'll leave by morning," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "Don't want to bring tongues waggin'. Folks judge harsh out here." The rancher studied her face, sunken and lined with sorrow though she was not much past youth. His silence stretched, a kind of answer in itself. Then, at last, he spoke. "You won't last a mile if you step out yonder. Snow'll take you. Better rest till the storm breaks." Her eyes filled, not with relief, but with a fear deeper than cold. "Charity always carries chains," she whispered. His jaw clenched. He had no words for that, no argument against her lived truth. Instead, he shifted, tossing more logs on the fire until the blaze filled the cabin with brightness. The girl crawled closer, letting the warmth soak her bones, and for the first time since he had seen her, her lips softened into something like the ghost of a smile. He sank into the chair opposite, the fire's glow painting the hollows of his face. He rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his words came spare as water in a dry creek. But now something pressed at him, urgent, undeniable. "No child ought to meet the cold this way," he said, voice carrying the gravel of conviction. "Not in God's country." The girl tilted her head. "Then why do folks beat us?" The question fell between them like an axe into wood. He had no answer that would not deepen her wound. He looked to the fire instead, watching sparks leap and vanish, until his throat unlocked with a memory he had not meant to give voice to. "People forget their own beginnings," he muttered. "But Scripture says, 'Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares.'" The girl's eyes widened, as if the words were lantern light cutting the dark. She repeated them under her breath, tasting them, holding them close. Her mother stirred faintly, eyes closing, her breathing steadier now in the cabin's warmth. The rancher leaned back, staring at the low rafters. Loneliness had been his shield for years, and now strangers lay upon his hearth, breaking it as easy as kindling. He wanted to turn away to keep distance, but the girl's gaze kept tugging at him, open, watchful, searching. He asked, after a long silence, "What's your name, little one?" She hesitated, as though even names could be stolen or punished. Then she whispered it, a sound as delicate as snow against glass. He nodded once, repeating it softly, then looked down at the child in her arms. The baby's face was red and pinched, but alive. "Strong lungs," he said. "That's something." The girl pressed her cheek to the bundle. "Ma'am says he was born fighting. Didn't want to breathe at first, but he came back." A muscle worked in the rancher's jaw. He could almost see his own infant boy, blue and still in his wife's arms, never coming back no matter how he had begged. His chest tightened as if the years collapsed into this fire-lit room. The girl spoke again, soft but insistent. "Sir, do you think God knows we're here?" His eyes met hers. He wanted to tell her no, that the plains were too wide and the heavens too silent. But the fire cracked loud, as if demanding honesty, and he heard his own voice say, He knows." The girl nodded, satisfied with that answer, though her eyelids drooped heavy with exhaustion. She curled beside her mother, the newborn pressed safe between them, and within minutes the three were lost to sleep, their breathing a fragile harmony in the cabin's quiet. The rancher remained seated, staring at them as though they were an apparition conjured from snow and silence. He felt the storm rattling outside, felt the old wounds stirring within him, and knew something had already shifted. They were not his, yet they had entered the hollow of his life as though the emptiness had been carved for them all along. The fire burned low, its light falling across the small girl's face. She murmured in her sleep, a word half-formed, but it carried the unmistakable shape of belonging. "Pa." The sound hit him harder than the winter wind, and he sat motionless, caught between the ache of memory and the terror of hope, as if the single syllable might unravel everything he had fought to keep buried. The storm spent itself by gray morning, leaving the land shivering and bright, crusted with ice that burned like powdered glass. He stepped outside to fetch wood and listen, the way men alone must listen, for the telltale hinge of trouble. Behind him the fire held, and the woman slept a steadier sleep, the baby tucked at her hollow chest. The girl was awake, though, watching him with solemn eyes from the chair as if the night had aged her. When he came back in, she whispered she could ride. He said only, "If you do, you mind my hand." He lifted her to the saddle and swung up behind, his coat wrapped around them both. The prairie was a quilt of glare and shadow, cottonwoods rimed and brittle, the creek whispering slush under a skin of ice. They did not speak much, but he felt her small back straighten every time they passed a fence line, as though invisible eyes climbed each post. In town the world narrowed, iron rings for hitching, the tinkle of a bell, wagon ruts hardened like scars. Windows blinked. Doors opened. Rumor woke like a hornet's nest. At the mercantile he bought flour, dried apples, a twist of cloth for bandages, and a packet of willow bark. The storekeep watched the girl from under his hat brim, lips twitching. "New hire?" he asked too lightly. "Mighty small for fence mending." The rancher counted coins without answering. The girl leaned her cheek against his sleeve, worn out and proud. "Ma'am had the baby," she said, voice bright with brave fact. The room tilted. A woman near the bolts of calico lowered her eyes, then raised them sharp. The storekeep's smile thinned to a moral. "That's so," he said. "On your place." The rancher's shoulders went stone. He gathered the parcels, nodded once, and turned. Outside, cold air met his face like water he could breathe. But the talk spilled through the door after him. Strays, no ring, shame, words that stuck like burrs to a long coat. On the boardwalk the girl squeezed his hand. "We're not trouble," she whispered, as if repeating a spell. He answered with silence, because anything he said might break open what little safety he could offer them yet. They stopped by the church because there was a basket of blankets left out for whoever needed them. The preacher was there, sweeping snow off the steps with the sleeve of his coat, a thin man with a winter-keen gaze. He looked at the girl, then at the rancher, and his mouth softened. "Mercy is a hard winter's wood," he said. "You think you'll run out if you use it, but it keeps making more. The rancher lifted a blanket, thick and blue. He did not ask for permission, and the preacher did not demand explanation. In the quiet between them, the girl whispered, almost to herself, "Show mercy to those on earth, and the one in heaven will show mercy to you." He had heard the saying years ago from a trail cook who laid his rug toward sunrise. The words came back now, warm as bread in cold hands. A rancher on the corner spat tobacco and narrowed his eyes. "Careful, friend," he drawled. "You'll ruin yourself with charity." The big man lifted the child to the saddle before he answered. "Reckon kindness never ruined a man." His tone was even, but the corners of the street seemed to flinch. Behind lace curtains, faces rippled like minnows. The preacher tipped his hat, not blessing so much as witness, and the two of them rode out as if through rain made of whispers. The girl did not look back. She held the blue blanket like a banner. The cabin smelled of stew bones he had left simmering, though he had no hunger. The woman was awake, color thin but truer. The baby slept in an improvised crib, a wooden drawer padded with shawl. She had folded the blankets, gathered the few things that were hers, and was tying a strip of cloth around her waist to hold the child close. "We'll be gone by sundown," she said, not meeting his eye. "You've done enough." The words were a kindness and a severance, like cutting a stitch before the wound has closed. "You're not well enough to stand the road," he said. She steadied herself, chin high. "Tongues will eat me alive if I stay." "They will eat her too," she added, glancing at the girl, "and the babe with us." He set the parcels on the table and unwrapped the cloth slowly, careful not to startle her fear. "Tongues already ate their fill in town," he said. "And we're still here." She flinched at "we" as if the word were a brand. She shifted the child higher and took a step, her knees folded, and she caught the table edge with a gasp. He reached out, stopped short of touching, then set his palm lightly at her elbow, steadying, not claiming. The girl moved between them with sudden seriousness, rummaged along the windowsill, and found a brittle sprig of sage he kept for smell against long nights. She pressed it into his hand as if arming him. He breathed the clean, bitter scent and felt his resolve take root. Hooves creaked outside. He rose with the sage in hand, ready to answer judgment at last. The snow broke into thaw, slow and stubborn, as if winter were reluctant to loosen its grip. Patches of mud showed through the white, and the creek roared with meltwater, swollen and impatient. Each day the light lingered longer at the horizon, filling the cabin with a softer gold. The woman sat by the window with the baby pressed against her breast, her face still pale but no longer the gray of surrender. She stitched seams on shirts that had long given up their threads, her hands trembling but steady enough to mend. The girl followed the rancher like a shadow, tugging on his sleeve whenever she could, eager to be useful. He taught her to scatter feed for the chickens, her laughter startling them into a flurry of wings before they settled down again. She dragged a bucket half her size to the pump, spilling more water than she saved, and he never scolded her. At night, when the fire burned low, she would curl on the floor near his chair, eyelids heavy, whispering questions until sleep claimed her. "Do horses dream, sir? Why do coyotes sing when the moon's bright?" Each question cracked his silence, drawing words he thought had long rusted shut. The woman tried too, though shame clung to her like a second skin. She swept the floor, stirred soup from what little he had, and offered thanks he waved away. When she reached too quickly for the kettle, her knees buckled, and he caught her elbow before she fell. She looked at him with eyes fierce as a cornered doe. "We'll leave once I can stand steady," she said, her voice brittle with pride. He studied her face, tired, scarred with hunger, yet lined with a dignity that would not bend. His reply came low, almost tender in its roughness. "You've a roof here. Ain't no debt owed for breathing." The words seemed to wound her more than kindness should, as if she did not know where to set them inside her heart. She turned back to the fire, lips pressed tight, while the baby's small cry filled the silence. Sundays drew them to the edge of town, where bells called thinly across the fields. The rancher had not set foot in the church since the day they buried his wife, but the girl's hand tugged his, and he did not resist. Inside, the benches creaked with neighbors shifting, eyes sharp as nails. The preacher's voice rose above them, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy." The words carried heavy, settling deep in the woman's bowed head. After the service, no one spoke to them, but the girl skipped in the sunlight, humming the hymn as though it were stitched into her bones. That evening, around the table, the rancher set down bowls of stew, the scent of onions and sage filling the cabin. The girl clapped her hands in delight. The mother tried to protest, "You've shared too much already." But the girl broke in, earnest and fierce. "Ma'am, it's not stealing when someone offers." The rancher met the woman's eyes across the candle flame, and though she quickly looked away, the faintest crack of something like trust began to show. Days softened into a rhythm. He split logs while the girl counted each one aloud, cheering as if he were performing a miracle. The woman sang softly to the baby, voice wavering but carrying a sweetness that filled the cabin like the scent of lilacs long gone. At dusk he sometimes found himself standing in the doorway, watching them. Girl tracing patterns on the baby's blanket, woman's hair caught in firelight, shadows rising around them. He told himself it was only caution, only vigilance. Yet something unspoken stirred, fragile and dangerous. One afternoon the wind shifted, warm with promise of spring. The girl chased a chicken into the yard, laughter bright against the sky. She turned suddenly, called him by the wrong name, "Pa," then froze, hand flying to her mouth. The rancher stopped, axe halfway to the stump. The word hung between them, heavier than any blade. The girl's eyes filled with panic, as though she had broken some law too holy to mend. He only set the axe down slow, lifted her into his arms, and carried her inside. Nothing was said, but that night he lay awake long after the fire dimmed, hearing the echo of that word like a hymn he had sworn never to sing again. The woman noticed. She moved quieter, as if to guard against expectation, as if one false step would send them all tumbling. When he offered her a shawl he found in a trunk, she folded it carefully and set it aside, too proud to wear it, too wounded to refuse outright. Her eyes searched his face once, softening with something he almost recognized, fear tangled with gratitude. The baby stirred in its sleep, and the woman rose to soothe it, her hair falling loose over her shoulders. For an instant, with the lamplight bending around her, the rancher saw not the stranger she had been but the possibility of something more, something he dared not name. His chest tightened with a longing that was equal parts hope and dread. Outside, coyotes called from the hills, their voices rising in a wild chorus that seemed to mock the fragile peace of the cabin. The woman rocked the baby, the girl leaned drowsy against his arm, and he stood in the threshold staring into the dark, knowing that peace this tender could not last. Somewhere beyond the hills, judgment waited, sharpening its teeth. The storm came without warning, a black wall of cloud rolling low across the plains, carrying with it a howl that shook the windows and set the rafters moaning. The rancher fastened shutters with hands raw from rope and wood, but the wind pried at every seam, rattling the cabin like a toy. Rain slashed sideways, finding cracks, dripping into pans he had hurriedly set on the floor. Inside, the fire sputtered, smoke stinging eyes and lungs. The woman clutched the baby against her breast, rocking in rhythm to the thunder, while the girl pressed herself to her side, whispering that it would pass. It always passed. But fear had a longer memory than weather. The woman's face was pale, drawn tight with panic, her hands fumbling for the bundle of shawls she had kept ready for days. "We can't stay," she gasped. "Walls fall, roof split, better to leave before it takes us." Her voice cracked with the weight of old betrayals, storms of fists and voices she had never outrun. She moved to the door, shawl around her shoulders, baby bound close, and the girl followed with wide, trembling eyes. The rancher turned from the window, rain streaming from his hat brim. "You step out in this, you'll drown before you're a mile gone." His words were steady, but his chest ached with the knowledge that reason rarely reached the wounded. The woman pulled the latch anyway, wind shrieking through the gap, lifting her hair like a banner. The girl cried out, grabbing her arm. "Ma'am, please. He'll think we don't love him." The words cut sharper than the storm, small and desperate, heavy with a truth she could not yet name. The woman froze, her eyes wild, torn between terror and something softer. It was then that the rancher crossed the room, his boots thudding against the planks, his frame filling the doorway as rain hammered down his shoulders. He did not reach for her by force, did not bar her path. He only stood there, soaked and trembling, and spoke words that had waited years behind his silence. "I lost a wife and son once," he said, voice breaking like dry timber. "Thought I'd buried every piece of me that could care again. Thought if I kept shut, if I kept alone, I could outlive the hurt. Then I found you three in the snow." The wind seemed to pause, as if listening. The girl clutched the edge of his coat, her face pressed to the wet fabric, and the woman's lips parted, though no sound came. Her eyes filled, not with shame this time, but with a grief that met his own. He reached out, slow as prayer, and placed his hand against the baby's back. The child squirmed, let out a thin cry, then quieted as if recognizing steadiness in the great trembling hand. He looked at the woman, rain dripping from his jaw, eyes unguarded for the first time. "Stay," he said simply. Something broke inside her, fear uncoiling, shame loosening its grip. Tears slipped down her cheeks, hot against the storm's chill. She sagged against the doorframe, no longer running, no longer pretending she could. The girl pressed close, wrapping both arms around her mother, and together they stepped back into the cabin's dim glow. He shut the door and set the bar across it, the sound firm as a vow. The storm still clawed at the roof, but inside there was only the crackle of the rekindled fire and the fragile rhythm of 3 breaths finding steadiness again. He knelt, clumsy with gentleness, taking the baby fully into his arms. For a long moment he held the small bundle, his rough fingers tracing the softness of a cheek, his throat thick with awe and terror. The woman lowered herself to the floor, knees weak, and watched him as though he were a stranger and a lifeline all at once. He did not speak of marriage or promises, did not paint futures he could not guarantee. He only rocked the child with emotion half forgotten, steady as the ticking of the clock on the wall, his eyes fixed on the tiny face as though anchoring himself to the present moment. The girl leaned her head against his knee, eyelids heavy, her small hand resting on the wood beside his own. The woman's breath slowed, her body softening, surrender not to defeat but to something she had never dared believe in, shelter without price. The firelight caught her features, and in that glow the rancher saw not a burden but the shape of a home he had thought forever lost. Outside, the storm raged, but inside a quiet bond rooted itself, unspoken yet binding as iron. They shared no vows, no ceremony, only the simple act of not leaving when fear howled loudest. The rancher lifted his eyes from the child to the woman, and she met his gaze with a softness that trembled but did not break. It wasn't wealth, nor promise, nor salvation shouted to the heavens. It was bread cooling on a rough-hewn table, the glow of lamplight against damp hair, the sound of a child breathing steady in the dark. He had thought himself ruined for tenderness, yet here it was, fragile and fierce, alive in his arms. The wind rattled the shutters one last time, then passed on. The cabin stood firm, and within it, so did they. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.